The recycled wool of my overcoat felt like 1,000 tiny needles against my skin. It wasn't the fabric itself. It was a soft, durable blend I'd favored for years. But the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes, sharp and critical, transformed the comfortable warmth into a prickly shroud of judgment. Here, in the hushed, sterile sanctuary of the first-class lounge at Heathrow Terminal 5, I was an anomaly, a glitch in their polished, curated reality. I saw my reflection mirrored in the gleaming marble floor, not a man of substance, but a hunched, spectral figure in a sea of tailored suits and shimmering dresses. My shoes, worn from countless miles of walking through the very cities I sought to heal, were a cartography of my life's work. Their scuffed leather a stark rebellion against the chorus of gleaming loafers and stiletto heels that tapped out a rhythm of impatient wealth. The air itself seemed to have a weight here, a density that came from the accumulated breath of 1,000 wealthy travelers who had passed through these doors, believing their money made them immune to the ordinary indignities of travel. I could hear the soft clink of crystal champagne flutes, the rustle of silk and cashmere, the low murmur of conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons. The lighting was carefully calibrated to make everyone look younger, healthier, more successful than they truly were. It was a theatre of illusion, and I was the one prop that didn't belong on the set. I ran my thumb over the worn leather of my satchel strap, feeling the grooves where my fingers had travelled 1,000,000 miles. This bag had been with me through floods in Bangladesh, through earthquakes in Nepal, through the desperate corridors of hospitals in war-torn cities. It had held vaccines that saved thousands of children, and now it held the papers that would save a city. And yet, to these people, it was just another piece of evidence that I didn't belong in their world. The marble floor was so polished I could see the reflection of the ceiling lights, tiny stars captured in stone. I watched Preston Thorne's reflection approach, his image distorted by the curve of the polished surface, making him look like the caricature of wealth he truly was. His shoes alone probably cost more than the annual salary of the cleaning staff, who had polished this floor to mirror perfection. I thought about Maria, the head of housekeeping at this terminal, whom I'd met 3 years ago when she couldn't afford surgery for her daughter. I'd paid for that surgery anonymously, through a foundation that didn't exist on paper. She didn't know it was me. No one knew. That was the way it had to be. The smell of lilies was starting to give me a headache, their sweetness too cloying, too artificial. Real flowers in a fake world. I preferred the smell of sawdust and honest sweat, the smell of work that produced something tangible, something that would outlast the person who made it. My wooden bird in the satchel, that would outlast me. The cedar would darken with age, the grain would become more pronounced, and some future generation would hold it and wonder about the hands that carved it. That was immortality enough for me. I didn't need my name on a building or a stadium. I didn't need a Forbes list ranking. I needed only to know that somewhere, someone was sleeping under a roof tonight because of something I'd done. That was my dividend. That was my return on investment. The lounge's air conditioning kicked in with a low hum, and I felt the temperature drop by a fraction of a degree. Climate control for people who had never known real discomfort. They didn't know what it was to shiver through a winter night with no heat, to watch your breath turn to frost inside your own home. I knew. I'd been in those homes. I'd held the hands of those people, and that was why I could sit in this cognac leather chair, enduring the contempt of the privileged, and feel nothing but patience. The reckoning was coming. I could wait. The smell of the lounge was an oppressive mixture of fresh lilies, expensive coffee, and the metallic scent of industrial air conditioning. It was the smell of privilege, an aroma that tried to mask the human anxiety that always lingers in airports. I sat in a cognac leather armchair that cost more than the annual rent of many families I helped. I felt the texture of the wood on the chair's armrest, solid oak, impeccably sanded, but without the soul of wood that has passed through the hands of a craftsman who loves it. A man whose jawline was as sharp and unforgiving as his suit's creases leaned conspiratorially toward his wife. His name, I would soon learn, was Preston Thorne, a name that seemed to carry the cold, hard weight of a tombstone. His voice, a low hiss of venom, was meant to be a whisper, but in the tense silence of the lounge, it slithered through the air with surgical precision. "I can't believe they let just anyone in here now," he breathed, his gaze flicking over me with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying a particularly unpleasant insect. "What's next? Stray animals? Beggars with tin cups? They've turned this place into a soup kitchen with better lighting." His wife, a woman so draped in diamonds they seemed to serve as armor, released a sound that was not quite a laugh, more of a brittle, metallic scoff. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated disdain, carefully cultivated over years of privilege and practiced superiority. "Preston, darling, please," she said, her voice dripping with practiced boredom. "Don't engage. It only encourages them. Them, not him. Not me as an individual, but as a category, a type. The unwashed masses who had the audacity to aspire to the same spaces they occupied." Preston leaned back in his chair, his arms spread across the back of the adjacent seats like a king claiming territory. His wife produced a compact mirror from her Hermes bag and began checking her makeup with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for an operation. She didn't look at me. I wasn't worth the acknowledgement. But Preston couldn't resist. He was the type of man who fed on the humiliation of others, who drew energy from their discomfort like a vampire drawing blood. "You know," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding seats, but not quite loud enough to be considered shouting. "I remember when places like this actually meant something, when there was a standard, a code." He looked directly at me, his eyes cold and calculating. Now they let anyone in. Anyone with a credit card and no shame. "I suppose," Preston continued, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that was somehow louder than his normal speaking voice, "that this is what they call democracy. Everyone gets a seat at the table, even if they haven't earned it, even if they don't know which fork to use." He laughed, a sound like gravel being poured down a drain. "But that's not really democracy, is it? That's just entropy, the decay of standards, the death of excellence." I didn't react. I simply tightened my grip on the worn leather handle of my single unassuming satchel, a bag that held nothing more than a book, a change of clothes, and the signed documents that would transfer nearly $1 billion into a city's desperate hands. I lowered my gaze, letting the storm of their contempt wash over me. A familiar and strangely calming ritual. It was the price of my anonymity, the toll required to walk among the people I aimed to serve. Before this story unfolds any further, I invite you to become a part of our community. Subscribe to The Humble Secret so you never miss a tale of karma and justice. And please, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. Your stories connect us all. I was James Blackwood, though to the people in this lounge, I was just a smudge on their horizon. My hands were a map of scars and calluses, decades of labor etched into the skin. My clothes, though clean and well-pressed, carried the unmistakable fade of garments valued for their utility rather than their brand. In this cathedral of glass and steel, I was a glitch in the architecture of luxury. As I approached the priority boarding lane, the atmosphere shifted. The line was short, a curated collection of men in bespoke suits and women whose jewelry pulsed under the fluorescent lights like captive galaxies. When I stepped in behind a man frantically checking a gold Patek Philippe, I felt the weight of a dozen stares. These weren't looks of curiosity. They were looks of biological confusion, as if a predator had accidentally wandered into a vegetarian's garden. The boarding agent, a young woman whose professional smile seemed carved from a single block of ice, raised her eyes to mine. Her gaze flicked down to my coat, lingered for a second on my scuffed leather boots, and then returned to my face with an expression of weary, forced patience. "Sir, the economy line is at gate B12, just a bit further down," she said, pointing a manicured finger toward the distant crowd, not even bothering to ask for my ticket. "I'm well aware of where economy is. Thank you," I replied. My voice held the steady, resonant calm that only years of working with seasoned oak can give a man. But my seat is on this flight, in first class. A sudden, vacuum-like silence fell over the line. The man in front of me stopped tapping his watch and turned slowly. That was Preston Thorne. He measured me from head to toe with a look designed to make a man feel like a smudge on a masterpiece. He let out a short, dry bark of a laugh. "You're joking, right?" Preston asked, his voice projected for everyone to hear. "Look at you. What do you do? Fix fences? Sand down deck chairs? This gate is for people who actually move the needle of the global economy, not for someone living off a state pension and scrap wood." The boarding agent cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. She held out her hand for my ticket. I handed her the boarding pass I'd printed at home, a plain sheet of A4 paper that looked almost offensive next to the gold-embossed digital passes. She scanned it. The confirmation beep sliced through the air, crisp and undeniable. Her eyes widened. She looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the paper. "Seat 1A, she whispered. Preston stepped forward, invading my personal space with the aggressive scent of his cologne. 1A? That's a clerical error. That's my usual seat. I demand to know how this labourer secured a spot in the premium cabin. "Perhaps," I said quietly. "The universe has a sense of humour." I didn't offer a defence. I simply took my ticket back and gave a slight respectful nod. "May I board?" I asked. She hesitated, glanced at Preston, who looked ready to combust, and finally stepped aside. "Right this way, Mr. Blackwood." I walked through the jet bridge, that long, sterile tunnel between worlds, feeling the heat of Preston's glare burning into the back of my neck. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in, the fluorescent lights buzzing with an intensity that matched the tension building inside me. I could hear my own footsteps echoing against the metal flooring, each step a reminder that I was walking into a crucible. The smell of jet fuel and ozone was stronger here, the air thinner. Through the small windows in the jet bridge, I could see the massive Boeing 787-10 gleaming in the London morning light. It was a machine of incredible complexity, capable of carrying hundreds of souls across vast distances, and yet it was nothing compared to the complexity of human cruelty and kindness. I knew this was just the prologue. Boarding was a formality. The true test would be the pressurized confinement of that luxury cabin. The next 6 hours would be a battle of wills, a test of character, a demonstration that money could buy comfort, but not class. Upon entering the aircraft, I was greeted by a flight attendant trained to calculate a passenger's net worth by the way they carried their shoulders. When she saw me, her smile didn't just fade, it recalibrated. She checked my ticket, looked at the first-class aisle, and her face became a mask of professional politeness that stopped several inches short of her eyes. "To your left, sir, seat 1A. Please allow us to take your bag and store it for you." "I'll keep it with me, thank you," I said, gripping my leather satchel firmly. Inside, alongside the envelope, were the tools of my soul, my journals, and a small hand-carved wooden bird I'd finished that morning. I settled into 1A. It was the pinnacle of modern aviation, a private suite with brushed metal accents and cream-coloured leather that felt almost organic under my fingertips. The seat had more adjustments than some cars I'd owned, and the entertainment screen was larger than the first television my family had ever possessed. I closed my eyes for a moment, seeking my centre. I wasn't here for the vintage Krug or the heated seats. I was here for a reckoning. The envelope in my satchel seemed to pulse with potential energy, a coiled spring waiting to be released. Minutes later, the cabin floor shuddered under heavy, arrogant footsteps. Preston Thorne had arrived. He didn't just board, he occupied the space, claiming the cabin as his sovereign territory. He threw himself into the seat directly across from me, separated only by a retractable privacy divider which he immediately slammed down with a violent thwack that made the metal frame vibrate. "Unbelievable," he muttered to the cabin at large, though his eyes were locked on me. "What is the world coming to? We pay $50,000 for a ticket precisely so we don't have to deal with the unwashed. And what do we find? A carpenter who smells of sawdust and cheap soap sitting in the flagship suite. Other passengers began to fill the remaining seats. A mid-tier tech mogul with a Bluetooth earpiece permanently attached to his head, a diamond heiress who checked her reflection in every available surface, and a high-priced corporate litigator who spoke loudly into his phone about crushing the opposition. As they passed me, their pace slowed. I felt the silent jury of the elite deliberating. It was an invisible wall of hostility. They communicated through micro-expressions, the slight crinkle of a nose, the tightening of a jaw, the deliberate look away. I was the intruder, the jagged stone in their smooth, silk-lined world. Preston, seeing he had an audience, raised his volume. "Hey you, James was it? Let me give you some free advice. Just because you managed, by some fluke or system error, to get onto this plane, doesn't mean you belong here. You can sit on leather, but you're still just a man who bleeds for a living. When we land, I'm going back to my triplex in Manhattan, and you're going back to your hole in the wall." He leaned into the aisle and snapped his fingers for the attendant with a sharp crack that echoed through the cabin. "Excuse me, could you bring some disinfectant? The air in this part of the cabin is feeling a bit heavy. And please, make sure the silver is accounted for. We wouldn't want anything misplaced during the flight, would we?" The flight attendant forced a nervous, high-pitched laugh, casting me a look of apology that was actually a confirmation of her silent complicity. She didn't rebuke him. No one did. The silence of the first-class cabin was a weapon. It was the silence of those who agreed that certain people simply shouldn't be allowed to breathe the same recycled air. I took a deep breath, inhaling the aroma of the expensive coffee being served. I wasn't angry. In truth, I felt a profound, aching pity for Preston. He believed his value was tied to the $50,000 receipt in his pocket, while my value was tied to the truth inside my envelope. The plane began to taxi. The vibration of the engines was a constant reminder that we were all in the same pressurized tube, 30,000 feet above the earth, where money couldn't buy a new pair of lungs if the oxygen ran out. Preston continued his performance, pulling out his phone to record a video for his followers. "Guys, you won't believe the luxury I'm dealing with in first class today. Proof that airport security is failing. I've got a high-end hobo in 1A. He pointed the camera at me, waiting for a reaction, an explosion, something he could use to humiliate me further. I simply looked into the lens and gave a slight, dignified nod, a gesture of grace he couldn't possibly comprehend. "Don't you speak, Carpenter?" Preston asked, pocketing the phone with a sharp motion. "Or did the cat get your tongue when you realized you have nothing to say to people of my stature?" "Silence is often the wisest response, Mr. Thorne," I replied calmly, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of certainty. It allows us to hear the things that the noise of the ego usually drowns out. He let out a raucous, mocking laugh, drawing more disapproving glances from the other passengers. But their disapproval was aimed at me for having the audacity to talk back. The wisest response? Spare me the hallmark philosophy. You are a nobody, and I am Preston Thorne. Remember that when the lights go down and you realize you're just a tourist in my world. The plane accelerated down the runway, the G-force pinning us into our seats with a pressure that made breathing an effort. As we punched through the grey London clouds into the brilliant, unforgiving light of the upper atmosphere, I knew the game had only just begun. Preston thought he owned the sky because he was sitting at the top of the pyramid. He had no idea that I was the man who had built the foundation of that pyramid, and that I was about to pull out the cornerstone that supported his entire reality. The hostile silence of first class settled in once more, broken only by the subtle clink of silver and the constant, low-frequency hum of the turbines. I looked out the window, watching the world below dissolve into a patchwork of toy houses and tiny cars. At this height, everyone looked exactly the same, small, fragile, and temporary. Preston ordered another double scotch and began flipping through a quarterly earnings report, huffing ostentatiously every time I shifted in my seat. He wanted me to know that my very existence was an affront to his comfort. What he didn't know was that I was counting every one of those insults, not for revenge, but to ensure that the lesson he was about to receive was etched permanently into his soul. The recycled air of the cabin felt thinner as we reached cruising altitude, a metallic taste clinging to the back of my throat. I sat motionless in my sanctuary of leather and brushed steel, my hands resting on the satchel in my lap. The wooden bird I'd carved sat on the tray table before me, its wings frozen in a posture of permanent flight. Preston Thorne had finally ceased his direct assault, retreating into a sullen, heavy silence, punctuated only by the aggressive flipping of pages and the occasional muttered complaint about the quality of the in-flight entertainment. The other passengers had settled into their routines of consumption: champagne, caviar, tablets glowing with stock portfolios. They had made their judgment of me in the first 5 minutes and found me unworthy of further consideration. I was furniture to them, a broken chair in an otherwise perfect room. But the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, imperceptibly at first, like the pressure change before a storm. The flight attendants moved with a new urgency, their professional smiles tightening at the corners. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm but carrying an undercurrent of gravity that made even Preston pause his performance. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected clear air turbulence ahead. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated until further notice." The fasten seatbelt sign chimed twice, a sharp, electronic heartbeat. I felt it before I saw it, a subtle change in the pitch of the engines, a vibration that travelled up through the floor and into my bones. The plane was a living thing, and it was tense. Preston laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. Turbulence. Perfect. As if this flight couldn't get any more third rate. The first jolt hit like a warning, a sharp, vertical drop that made my stomach lurch. The plane groaned, a sound of stressed metal that no amount of engineering could completely silence. The Diamond Heiress in 3C let out a small, involuntary yelp. The corporate litigator gripped his armrests with white-knuckled intensity. Then the sky turned violent. It wasn't turbulence. It was a maelstrom. The plane bucked and twisted like a horse trying to throw a rider. The engines screamed, their whine rising to a pitch that vibrated in my teeth. The cabin became a theatre of chaos. Drinks spilling, bags falling from overhead compartments, screams cutting through the sterile air. And then, the moment that would change everything. Elena, the flight attendant, had been securing the galley when the worst of it hit. A massive downdraft slammed the aircraft, a giant hand swatting us toward the ocean. The sensation of weightlessness lasted for 3 agonizing seconds, followed by a bone-jarring impact as the wings caught the air again. Eleanor was thrown from her feet. Her body hit the ceiling with a sickening thud before crashing back down. The service tray she had been holding, laden with porcelain mugs, a heavy silver pot of scalding Earl Grey, and several glass carafes, was launched into the air like a cluster of shrapnel. Clara, the young medical student in 1B, had been looking out the window. She didn't see the tray. She didn't see the heavy silver pot, filled with near-boiling water, arcing through the air directly toward her face. But I saw it. Time didn't slow. It crystallized. In that fraction of a second, I saw the trajectory, the physics, the inevitable mathematics of disaster. The pot was heavy, solid, filled with nearly a gallon of scalding water. If it hit Clara in the face, as it was clearly going to do, she would be scarred for life. Blinded, perhaps. Disfigured, certainly. Her dreams of becoming a doctor, of helping others, of making a difference in the world, all of it could end in this moment, in this pressurized metal tube hurtling through the sky. And for what? Because a wealthy man wanted his coffee served at exactly the right temperature. Because the airline prioritized luxury over safety. Because fate was cruel and random and didn't care about justice or fairness or the quality of a person's soul. No, not on my watch. Not while I had breath in my body and strength in my limbs. I unbuckled my seatbelt with hands that moved of their own accord. muscle memory from decades of working with wood, of shaping material to my will. I lunged across the narrow space between our seats, my body twisting in midair, presenting my back and shoulder as a shield between Clara and the flying debris. The silver pot struck me with the force of a punch from a heavyweight boxer. The lid flew off. The scalding water cascaded over my shoulder, down my back, soaking through my coat and shirt in an instant. The pain was immediate and absolute, a white-hot explosion that made every nerve ending scream in protest. I felt the water burn through the layers of fabric, felt it reach my skin and keep burning, felt the heat burrow deep into the dermis where it would continue to destroy tissue, long after the liquid itself had cooled. Porcelain mugs shattered against my spine, their shards slicing through the wet wool of my coat like tiny knives. I felt the cuts, sharp and stinging, adding to the symphony of pain that was now my entire existence. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry out. I collapsed onto the floor, curling my body around Clara's legs, my arm draped over her head like a protective wing, my back taking the brunt of what was still falling from the galley. The pain was a tsunami, a relentless wave that crashed over me again and again. I could feel my skin blistering, could feel the tissue damage spreading, could feel the shock beginning to set in as my body tried to protect itself from the trauma. Through the haze of agony, I heard Clara's voice, high and frightened, but somehow still steady. "James! Oh my God, James!" I tried to answer, but my throat was tight. My teeth gritted so hard I thought they might shatter. I focused on my breathing, on the rhythm of inhale and exhale, on the simple fact that I was still alive, still conscious, still able to protect this young woman who had shown me nothing but kindness. If you believe that a person's true worth is measured not by their wealth, but by their character, please take a moment to hit that like button to show your support. The climax of this story will restore your faith in justice. The porcelain mug shattered against my back, the shards slicing through the fabric. I stayed curled on the floor, my teeth gritted so hard I thought they might shatter. The pain was a living thing, a rhythmic pulse that matched the steady beat of the Boeing's engines. "James!" Clara gasped, her voice thick with horror. She reached out, her hands trembling as she touched my shoulder. "Oh my God, James! You blocked it. Are you all right?" I managed to rasp, my voice a jagged shadow of its usual self. "I'm fine. You saved me." Clara's eyes were wide, filling with tears as she saw the steam rising from my soaked clothes. From across the aisle, Preston Thorne let out a harsh, jagged laugh. It wasn't the laugh of a man who was relieved to be alive. It was the laugh of a man whose fear had fermented into a toxic, defensive cruelty. "Bravo!" Preston sneered, his voice loud enough to carry through the cabin. "A hero's exit for the man in the rags. Tell me, Blackwood, was that part of your repurposing plan, turning yourself into a human floor mat?" Clara whirled around, her eyes flashing with cold, righteous fury. "Shut up, Preston. He's seriously hurt." "Hurt?" Preston leaned over the partition. "He's a liability. Look at the mess. The cabin smells like a burnt kitchen and a wet dog. He probably did it on purpose, a desperate grab for attention from a man who has nothing else to offer." Clara was already in motion. She grabbed the medical kit from the flight attendant's trembling hands. "I'm a nursing student," she said, her voice snapping into a sharp, authoritative tone. "Elena, I need cold water. Not ice. Cold water. And clean towels. Now." She knelt beside me, her hands steady as she began to carefully cut away the soaked wool of my sleeve. As the fabric came away, a collective gasp went through the cabin. The burn was severe, a map of angry, blistered red stretching from my neck down to my elbow. "It's okay, James," she whispered, her voice a soft anchor in the storm of my pain. "I've got you. You're going to be okay." I looked into her eyes, and for a moment the pain receded. I saw in her the very thing I had spent my life searching for and funding, the spark of genuine, selfless humanity. "I told you," I whispered, a faint, pained smile touching my lips. The view is much better when you aren't afraid of the fall. The plane stabilized, breaking through the clouds into clear air. But in the center of the first-class cabin, the hierarchy had collapsed. The man who owned nothing had sacrificed everything, and the man who owned everything had revealed he had nothing at all. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding different than it had at the start of the journey. Gone was the rehearsed tone. Instead, there was a gravity that made the entire cabin sit up straighter. Ladies and gentlemen, we are 20 minutes from John F. Kennedy International Airport. Due to an extraordinary request from the mayor's office and the Port Authority, we will be taxiing to a private gate. We ask that all passengers remain in their seats until a very special guest is escorted from the aircraft. The cabin erupted into a low, frantic hum of speculation. Preston Thorne's head snapped toward the window, a predatory gleam returning to his eyes. He began to preen, smoothing his disheveled hair. "The mayor's office," he whispered. "They've finally come to their senses. They must have tracked the flight. They know I'm coming in with the final bid for the hospital project." He turned to his wife. "You see, darling, status always finds its level. They probably want a photo op on the tarmac. A visionary returns to save the city's children." He turned his gaze toward me, his sneer more triumphant than ever. "You hear that, Blackwood? The city-wide significance? That's for me. While you're being wheeled off to some county hospital in a generic ambulance, I'll be shaking hands with the leadership of this city. That's the difference between a man who builds and a man who just exists." I didn't say a word. I just looked at the wooden bird on my tray table. I felt a pang of regret for the privacy I was about to lose. But the children of St. Jude's couldn't wait any longer. Clara looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, dawning realization. She looked at the manila envelope, then at the bandage on my arm, and then back at my face. She didn't say it aloud, but the question was written in her gaze. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. She let out a soft, shaky breath, her hand flying to her mouth. She saw the humble secret for what it was, not just money, but a life spent in the service of an ideal. The plane tilted as we made our final approach. The wheels locked into place with a mechanical thud. The lights of the runway began to streak past, a blur of white and amber. We taxied for what felt like an eternity, moving past the standard terminals toward the restricted area of the airfield. I could see the flashing lights of police escorts in the distance, a blue and red kaleidoscope reflecting off the polished fuselage. Preston was practically vibrating in his seat. "Here we go," he said, his voice cracking with excitement. "The Thorne era officially begins." The plane came to a final, smooth stop. The engines began their long, whining power down. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy and uncertain. Clara reached out to steady me, her touch a constant source of strength. Elena moved to the door, her hand on the lever, her eyes fixed on me. She didn't look at the manifest. She looked at the man who had forgiven her before she even asked. The door hissed open, and the humid, salty air of the New York night flooded the cabin. What I saw took my breath away. Not police, not the mayor standing alone, but a sea of people, hundreds of them. They held candles and signs, their faces turned up toward the aircraft with an expression I hadn't expected. Reverence. And at the front of the crowd, standing on a small platform, was Mayor Elena Rodriguez herself. Next to her, cameras from every major network pointed at the jet bridge. Behind her, a banner read, "Welcome home, the carpenter." Preston pushed past me, his face flushed with triumph. "Make way," he bellowed. Preston Thorne, CEO of Thorne Developments, coming through. He stepped into the opening, his arms raised in a victory pose, ready to greet his public. But the crowd was silent. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at me. Mayor Rodriguez stepped forward, her microphone catching every word. "James Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The carpenter of grace. The man who has given away $3 billion in anonymous donations. The founder of the Grace Foundation. We have been waiting for you. The crowd erupted, not in applause for a businessman, but in something deeper, a recognition of goodness. Preston froze. His face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: confusion, denial, and finally, dawning horror. "No," he whispered. "No, that's impossible. He's a carpenter." "He is the carpenter," Mayor Rodriguez said, stepping aside to reveal two FBI agents. "And you, Mr. Thorne, are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and crimes against the people of this city." The agents moved forward. Preston stumbled back, his face white, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume. "You can't do this," he screamed. "Do you know who I am? I'm Preston Thorne. I'm worth $500 million. "Your wealth was built on stolen homes and broken lives," Mayor Rodriguez said quietly. "And today, that debt comes due." I walked past him, my shoulder burning, my heart full. I didn't look back. At the bottom of the stairs, a young girl waited. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She held a small wooden bird, one I had carved years ago and donated to a charity auction. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her voice tiny. "Are you really the carpenter?" I knelt down, ignoring the pain, ignoring the cameras, ignoring everything except her. "I'm just a man who believes that every person deserves a roof over their head," I said softly. She smiled and handed me the bird. "I wanted to give this back to you, so you know that what you did, it mattered." I took the bird, my eyes wet. "It always matters," I whispered. "Every kind thing, every sacrifice. It always matters." Behind me, I heard the click of handcuffs. I heard Preston Thorne sobbing. I heard the crowd cheering. But I only saw the girl, and the bird, and the truth that had finally come to light. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember that goodness still exists in this world. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of karma and justice, because sometimes the most humble hands hold the power to change everything. The crowd cheered as I walked into the New York night, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had finally come home. I thought about the days that would follow, the interviews, the revelations, the end of my anonymity. I thought about the foundation I would build, not in secret anymore, but in the open, with others who shared my vision. I thought about Clara, who would become my partner in more than just this journey, who would help me navigate the strange new world of visibility. But most of all, I thought about my father, about the way he would have laughed at the irony of it all. The billionaire carpenter, the invisible man who became a symbol. "You did good, son," I imagined him saying, his calloused hand on my shoulder. "You did real good." And as the New York skyline sparkled around me, as the cheers of the crowd washed over me like a wave, I knew he was right. The carpenter was coming home, and this time, he wasn't alone. The morning after the incident, I lay in a private room at St. Jude's Hospital, the very institution I had funded anonymously for over a decade. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had built this wing with my own hands, hammering nails alongside construction workers who never knew their volunteer was a billionaire. And now I was a patient in one of its beds, my shoulder wrapped in bandages, my back covered in salve and gauze. The pain was a constant companion now, a dull throbbing that reminded me of the sacrifice, of the choice I had made in that split second over the Atlantic. I didn't regret it, not for a moment. But I also didn't fully understand why I had done it, not consciously. The action had been pure instinct, muscle memory from decades of protecting the vulnerable, of standing between danger and those who couldn't defend themselves. I thought about my father, a carpenter like me, who had died when I was 16. He had never made more than $30,000 in a year, but he had given away half of everything he earned. "A man's worth," he used to say, his calloused hands guiding mine over a piece of sandpaper, "is measured by what he's willing to give up for someone who can never pay him back." I remembered the winter he gave our only winter coats to a family whose house had burned down. We shivered through 3 months of Wisconsin cold, huddled around a wood stove he had built from scrap. My mother never complained. She just knitted us sweaters and sang while she worked. That was the year I learned that warmth comes from the heart, not from fabric. My father would have understood why I lunged across that airplane cabin. He would have nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and said something about the wood knowing its grain, about a man knowing his purpose. The door opened, and Clara entered, carrying a cup of coffee and a newspaper. She had refused to leave my side since we landed, declining her connecting flight to medical school orientation. "Some things are more important than schedules," she had said when I tried to convince her to go. "How's the shoulder?" she asked, setting the coffee on the bedside table. "Throbbing," I admitted, "but manageable." She smiled, that same gentle smile that had anchored me in the storm of pain. "You know, I've been thinking about why you did it." "Instinct," I said. "Anyone would have done the same." "No." She shook her head firmly. "Not anyone. Most people would have frozen, or ducked, or called for help. You moved, without hesitation, without calculation. That's not instinct, James. That's character." I looked out the window at the New York skyline, at the buildings I had helped fund, at the lives I had touched without ever claiming credit. "My father," I said quietly, "used to say that a man's true measure isn't taken when he's comfortable. It's taken when he's tested, when he has to choose between what's easy and what's right." He sounds like he was a good man. He was. He died working, building a habitat house for a single mother. Heart attack on the roof. He was 62. I paused, remembering the phone call, the sudden emptiness, the realization that I would never again feel those calloused hands on my shoulder. I was there. I held him while he went. His last words were about the flashing on the dormer. He was worried the water wouldn't shed properly. Clara sat down on the edge of the bed, her eyes soft with empathy. "That's beautiful, in a terrible way. It's the way he would have wanted to go, doing something that mattered, building something that would outlast him." I shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at the burns. "That's why I started the foundation, not for glory, not for tax breaks, for him. Because he showed me that one person, with enough determination and enough disregard for their own comfort, can change the world." "And now?" she asked. "Now that everyone knows who you are, what's next for James Blackwood?" I thought about the question, really thought about it. For 40 years, I had hidden behind anonymity, believing that distance was necessary for effectiveness. That if people knew who I was, they would treat me differently, flatter me, try to use me, and they probably would. But I also realized, lying in that hospital bed with my body aching and my heart full, that hiding had become its own kind of prison. "Now," I said slowly, "I think I stop hiding, not for me, but for them, for the people who need to see that goodness exists. That kindness isn't extinct. That one person can make a difference." Clara nodded, understanding immediately. "They need a symbol. They need a reminder that wealth doesn't make you important, that power doesn't make you right, that the only thing that truly matters is what you do with the time you have." The door opened again, and Mayor Rodriguez entered, followed by a man in a suit I didn't recognize. "Mr. Blackwood," the mayor said, her voice warm but formal, "I hope we're not disturbing you." "Not at all, Madam Mayor. Please, come in." The man in the suit stepped forward, extending a hand that I shook carefully with my uninjured arm. "Robert Chen, Special Agent, FBI. I'm in charge of the Thorne investigation. I wanted to personally thank you for your assistance, and to tell you that the evidence you provided, the documents from your envelope, has already led to 3 additional arrests. Thorne wasn't working alone." "I suspected as much," I said. "Men like him rarely are." "The money he stole," Agent Chen continued, "it's being recovered. Slowly, but surely. Your documentation made all the difference. Without it, we would have spent years tracing shell companies and offshore accounts. With it, we cut straight to the heart of the operation. Good. The people he displaced, they'll get their homes back. Some will. Some is complicated, but we're working on it. And your foundation has already stepped in to provide temporary housing for the families most affected. I nodded, satisfied. That's all I ever wanted. Not punishment, justice, restoration. Mayor Rodriguez moved closer to the bed. Mr. Blackwood, I won't take up much more of your time, but I wanted to ask you something. Officially, this time. Ask away. The city is facing a crisis. Not just the Thorn scandal, but a housing shortage that gets worse every year. We need someone to lead a new initiative. Someone with resources, yes, but also with vision. Someone who understands that a building isn't just steel and glass. It's a home. It's a future. She paused, gathering her courage. I'm asking you to come out of the shadows, not just as a donor, but as a leader. The city needs the carpenter. I looked at Clara. She nodded, her eyes encouraging. I looked out the window again, at the skyline that had been my canvas for decades, at the city that had become my home in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until now. On one condition, I said, name it. That we don't just build buildings, that we build community, that every project includes job training for local residents, that every development has space for art, for gathering, for life, that we remember that a city isn't made of concrete. It's made of people. Mayor Rodriguez smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from a politician in years. I wouldn't have it any other way. She left, and Agent Chen with her, and I was alone with Clara and my thoughts. You're going to do it, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm going to try. She stood up, leaning over to adjust my pillow. You know, I think I might stay in New York. At least for a while. Defer my enrollment. Clara, you can't do that. Medical school can wait. She cut me off gently but firmly. There are things happening here. Important things. And I have a feeling that you might need someone to keep an eye on you. Make sure you don't give away everything you own in the first week. I laughed, and the movement hurt my shoulder, but I didn't care. You might be right. I'm always right. It's one of my many talents. She grinned, and for a moment, the pain receded, replaced by something warm and unexpected. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of something I hadn't dared to imagine. The afternoon light slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the room. I thought about my father again, about the way he would have laughed at the irony of it all. The billionaire carpenter, the invisible man who became a symbol. I thought about Preston Thorne, sitting in a jail cell somewhere, his empire in ruins, his name synonymous with greed and corruption. I didn't hate him. Pity was closer to the truth. He had spent his life collecting things that didn't matter, and now he had nothing that did. And I thought about the girl with the wooden bird, about the thousands of people who had slept under roofs I had provided, about the vaccines and the scholarships and the surgeries and the small kindnesses that had rippled outward from my anonymous donations. It had been enough, more than enough. But maybe, just maybe, it could be more. Maybe it was time to stop being a ghost in the machine of charity and become a voice for the voiceless. To use my visibility, not for glory, but for advocacy. To stand in front of cameras and say what I had always believed, that every human being deserves dignity, deserves shelter, deserves a chance. Clara, I said, my voice quiet but certain. Yes? Do you believe in second chances? She looked at me, really looked at me, and her expression softened into something that looked a lot like understanding. I believe in third and fourth chances too, she said. I believe in as many chances as it takes. Good. Because I'm going to need them. All of them. She took my hand, her fingers warm and strong around mine. You've got them. Whatever you need. I'm here. Outside, the city hummed with life. Millions of stories unfolding simultaneously, millions of choices being made, millions of possibilities waiting to be born. And somewhere in that vast tapestry, a new thread was beginning. A thread spun from sacrifice and kindness, from anonymity and revelation, from the simple belief that one person can change the world. The carpenter was coming home. And this time, he wasn't alone.